Imagine for a moment a castle that sleeps. The stone breathes cold air, the narrow windows cradle bits of frozen wind, and the great hall, tall as a cathedral, echoes with its own stillness. Somewhere in the distance, a single shimmer of orange light trembles against the grey, and the air smells faintly of baked wood and glowing metal. It is a sign that even in the heart of winter there was still a small island of warmth, carried not by magic but by human hands, quiet, portable, and fragile. When we picture medieval castles, we tend to see them as warm, cozy refuges, huge fireplaces roaring, tapestries glowing, noblemen drinking by the light of flickering torches. But the truth was far colder. Real castles were stone refrigerators, damp, draughty, and mercilessly frigid even in summer. Surviving inside them during the brutal winters of Europe required patience, craft, and knowledge that has long been forgotten. The people who lived within those walls learned not to fight the cold directly, but to tame it, one ember, one fabric, one clever trick at a time. So tonight, as the world outside your window drifts towards silence, let's settle into the story of how they did it. How lords, servants, scribes, and even their dogs turned bare stone fortresses into living homes. These are the quiet secrets of medieval warmth, the humble miracles that turned frost into sleep. The first and most faithful companion against the cold was the metal brazier, a small portable stove glowing with coals drawn from the great hearth of the castle's kitchen. In an age before central heating, this humble bowl of fire was life itself. It could be carried from room to room, from the lord's chamber to the scribe's desk, from the great hall to the servants' quarters. Wherever it went, warmth followed. Medieval blacksmiths treated the brazier not merely as a tool but as an art form. Some were decorated with curling vines, animal motifs, or family crests cut through the metal in delicate patterns. Yet their beauty was only secondary to their function. Built of iron or bronze, a brazier stood on tall legs so it would not burn the wooden floors, and its grated walls allowed air to feed the coals evenly. A heavy lid sat on top, not just to keep sparks from escaping, but to let the owner control how fiercely the fire breathed. Their sizes varied wildly. Small ones, no larger than a dinner plate, could be held on the knees to warm the hands. Medium-sized braziers sat beside beds or under desks, offering a steady comfort while someone read, wrote, or sewed through the long winter evenings. The largest, broad as a modern nightstand, were capable of heating entire chambers, turning vast echoing halls into places where breath no longer fogged in the air. But the brazier's true power lay not in its metal but in what burned inside it. The charcoal used to feed it was a product of precise labor. It wasn't simply firewood. It was wood that had been half burned without air inside sealed pits or kilns. This made it light, smokeless, and incredibly efficient. Oak and beech charcoal glowed for hours, releasing deep, steady warmth that filled the air like invisible velvet. Without it, the use of indoor braziers would have been impossible. With it, they could maintain heat quietly through the night, long after the hearth's flames had died. In grand castles, the brazier became a symbol of comfort, a companion in the silence of stone rooms, a piece of living fire you could bring to your side. It hissed softly when stirred, cast shadows that danced like spirits on the wall, and carried with it the scent of metal and ember, a scent that meant safety. Without those simple, ingenious designs, even the richest lord would have shivered beneath fur and silk. The brazier turned castles from lifeless monuments into habitable spaces, bridging the distance between the warmth of the kitchen and the loneliness of a cold chamber. And when the world outside howled with snow and wind, it was the small, glowing heart of iron that kept the human heart alive. When the castle's main hearth dimmed and the last coals in the brazier began to fade, people turned to something even simpler, stones and bricks warmed in fire. It was a method as old as time itself, but within those frozen walls it became an art. Smooth river stones were chosen with care, for they could endure long hours of heat without cracking. Servants placed them deep in the kitchen hearth, where flames licked and whispered over them for 2 or 3 hours, until they glowed faintly, like buried suns. When they were ready, the stones were wrapped carefully in thick wool, old furs, or rough leather pouches, enough to shield the skin from burns but still let the warmth seep through slowly. One such stone, weighing perhaps 2 or 3 kilograms, could hold its heat for 6 to 8 hours. Placed under the bedclothes an hour before sleep, it could turn a freezing straw mattress into a pocket of blissful comfort. Servants often performed this duty every night, preparing what they called night stones. They carried them, one by one, through the dark corridors, their cloth wrappings steaming faintly in the cold air. By the time their lords climbed into bed, the sheets were no longer icy. They were soft, fragrant with smoke, and warm as a human embrace. Archaeologists have found proof of these rituals. At Warwick Castle in England, stone recesses were discovered near ancient fireplaces, shelves meant specifically for heating stones. Nearby lay scraps of thick wool fabric used to wrap them. In the women's quarters, smaller round stones with holes drilled through them were uncovered. Through those holes strings once passed, allowing noble ladies to wear the stones against their chests, or hold them in their hands like warm jewellery during long winter ceremonies. Even the humblest peasants used the same principle. Heated bricks or pebbles were slipped beneath layers of straw or tucked under cloaks during cold work shifts. Some families fashioned small wooden boxes with holes in the top, primitive foot warmers. Inside, hot stones were placed, and through the openings people could rest their feet above the rising heat. It was an invention born of necessity, yet its logic was perfect: heat the person, not the room. Those who worked still and silent jobs, the scribes, monks, and seamstresses, often relied on these simple inventions. They would keep one stone underfoot while another warmed by the fire, exchanging them throughout the night like a slow, steady heartbeat of comfort. In its quiet way, this method captured something profound about medieval life. Survival wasn't about fighting the cold head-on, but about weaving small circles of warmth within it. A castle was too vast, too stone-hearted to conquer, but a single stone, heated well and placed with care, could keep a person safe until morning. If all else failed, if the fires dimmed, the braziers cooled, and even the warm stones gave up their glow, there was still one unfailing source of heat left: the human body. Sleeping together was not a matter of affection or custom. It was survival. In the vast unheated halls of medieval castles, a single person in bed would freeze before dawn, but 6 or 8 together could create something remarkable. A human body at rest gives off around 100 watts of heat. 8 bodies pressed close beneath layers of fur could produce nearly a kilowatt, about the same as a small modern heater. This was the unspoken truth behind those enormous medieval beds that can still be seen in old castles, massive frames 3 meters wide and long enough to fit a family, servants, and sometimes even guests. Parents, children, and attendants all shared the same space, layered like the blankets that covered them. Children always slept in the middle, between adults, where the warmth was strongest and the drafts weakest. The elderly and the sick, too, were placed toward the center, surrounded by healthy bodies. There was an unspoken etiquette to this communal sleep: the strong on the edges, the vulnerable in the middle. It wasn't romance, it was strategy. On the coldest nights, even class differences melted away. Chronicles tell of noblemen sharing beds with their grooms, not out of equality, but because warmth mattered more than rank. Beds themselves were engineered to trap this human heat. Thick wool curtains hung around them, creating small private chambers within the larger icy rooms. Inside, the air could be 10 degrees warmer than outside. The mattress was stuffed with straw or feathers, then layered with sheets of linen, blankets of wool, and finally heavy furs, bear, wolf, or sheepskin, spread across the top. When the bed curtains were drawn and the last candle snuffed out, the effect was remarkable within minutes. The shared breath and the trapped air turned that curtained space into a living cocoon. In an age without electricity, that was as close as one could get to central heating. It may sound primitive, even uncomfortable to modern ears, but for those who lived behind cold walls of stone, This simple act of closeness was salvation. They didn't speak of warmth as something the fire gave. It was something they gave each other. When dawn crept into the castle, grey and shivering, the air inside felt little warmer than the world outside. The fire in the great hall might have smouldered through the night, but its reach was weak. The corridors were cold tunnels of stone, and every breath hung white in the air. To survive that chill, medieval people relied on the most personal defense they had: their clothing. Layering was not merely fashion. It was science learned through centuries of trial and endurance. A single tunic could never keep the cold away, but 8 layers, carefully chosen and arranged, could. Each piece of fabric was a trap for warmth, catching thin pockets of air between the fibers. The more layers one wore, the more invisible walls of heat were built around the body. The first layer was always linen, soft and breathable, resting directly against the skin. Linen absorbed sweat and dried quickly, keeping the wearer from becoming damp and chilled. Archaeologists have found scraps of medieval linen that still survive, proof of its resilience and the faith people placed in it. Over the linen came wool. Wool was the true magic of the Middle Ages, one of the few materials that could stay warm even when wet. Its fibers formed millions of tiny air pockets that trapped heat while letting moisture escape. A thick wool tunic was worth more than fur because it breathed. Then came the cloak, the long outer layer that turned every man and woman into a walking shelter. Cloaks were heavy, sometimes weighing several kilograms, and treated with oils or animal fats to resist rain and snow. In poor castles they were coarse and simple. In rich ones they were marvels of tailoring, trimmed with fur and dyed in deep colours that glowed by firelight. The wealthiest nobles went further, wearing fur-lined robes made of beaver, sable or marten, soft, luxurious, and astonishingly warm. Fur was worn with the hair inward, pressed against the skin to trap body heat. Beaver especially was prized. It was warmer than wool, and a sign of high status. At Edinburgh Castle, archaeologists once uncovered the remains of a 14th century woman's gown made of 12 distinct layers: linen undershirts, thin wool tunics, thicker wool cloaks, and a fur-lined cape on top. It wasn't simply clothing, it was armor against the cold, and yet it was beautiful. The layers cut to move gracefully even under the weight of winter. The head, too, was protected carefully. It was said that one loses nearly half of one's warmth through the head, and medieval people took that seriously. Men wore hoods sewn directly into their cloaks, while women wrapped their heads in veils, wimples, or caps of felted wool. Nobles favoured fur hats, round and thick, sometimes trimmed with gold thread, while monks pulled their cowls tight around their faces, breathing warmth into the folds. Even the hands and feet, so often forgotten, were protected by layers. Leather shoes were lined with wool or fur, then greased with animal fat to make them waterproof. Inside, thick woolen stockings clung to the legs and were tied to a belt to keep them from slipping. Over gloves of soft leather came mittens of wool, one over the other, trapping heat in a small bubble of still air. And beneath all this, the nobility wore something like the earliest form of thermal underwear: thin woolen shirts and leggings, fitting close to the body, insulating from within. Women, in particular, had an advantage. Their long dresses, layered and heavy, formed a natural tent of warmth around their legs. Under the outer dress, several skirts of wool added weight and heat, turning even the coldest halls into bearable spaces. The rustle of those skirts, soft and steady, became part of the castle's winter music. Inside these many layers, people moved slowly, deliberately. The cold taught them patience. Every garment was part of a system, a small, personal fortress within the larger fortress of stone. So when a medieval person walked through the echoing halls of a castle, their breath rising in clouds, they carried their own warmth with them. Fire and blankets could fail, but the clothing, layer upon thoughtful layer, was a kind of faith. Even with fires burning and cloaks wrapped tightly, the cold of a castle was relentless. Stone, for all its strength, is a poor keeper of warmth. It absorbed the chill of winter, and breathed it back into every corner, into the floors, the stairwells, and the beds. Yet people of the Middle Ages learned to fight back, not by rebuilding their walls, but by dressing them. Textiles became the silent defenders of comfort. They transformed bare fortifications into habitable spaces, not merely through beauty, but through function. Every surface that could hold fabric, walls, windows, doors, even ceilings, was clothed in layers meant to trap air and soften the cold's assault. Thick woolen tapestries, woven by patient hands over months or even years, hung from the highest halls. They were not only decorations but tools of survival. A tapestry 3 or 4 centimeters thick could raise the temperature of a room by nearly 10 degrees. Behind it, a thin cushion of air formed, an invisible blanket that stopped drafts from creeping through the cracks of the stone. In wealthy castles, entire systems of wall coverings were designed. At Caernarfon Castle in Wales, archaeologists discovered rows of small iron hooks embedded in the stone, proof that walls were once completely draped. First, a coarse base layer of rough wool was hung close to the wall. Over it, finer tapestries displayed scenes of battle, myth, or devotion, saints with golden halos, kings on horseback, gardens of paradise woven in thread. Behind their beauty, they were insulation. Each autumn, when the first frosts came, castles performed what was known as the warming. Servants climbed ladders to hang the thick draperies, unrolled carpets across the floors, and covered beds with velvet curtains and fur. Even the doorways were veiled with heavy cloth instead of solid doors. It was not just preparation, it was ritual. The castle dressed for winter as a knight dressed for battle. Windows, those rare and precious openings in medieval walls, were the greatest enemies of warmth. Glass was a luxury few could afford, and even when it was available, it was fragile and uneven. Instead, ox bladders or sheets of oiled parchment were stretched tightly across wooden frames, creating translucent barriers that let in light but kept out the wind. At night, servants closed thick wooden shutters and layered them with wool curtains to trap every bit of heat. The combination was surprisingly effective, primitive double glazing centuries before its time. The floors, too, became part of the fight. Cold stone was covered with straw, changed weekly to keep it clean, then overlaid with animal hides or rugs. In noble chambers, imported carpets from the east were laid down, their intricate patterns now serving a simpler purpose to keep feet from freezing. The bed itself became a world within a world. Great canopied frames with drawn curtains were not merely for privacy or grandeur, they created small chambers of warmth. When the curtains were pulled shut and the bodies within began to breathe and stir, the air inside could grow almost cozy, even as frost clung to the glass and the halls beyond remained silent and frozen. Sometimes, noble women ordered special sleeping tents to be built within their rooms, a wooden frame covered with layered fabric, sealing in warmth like a cocoon. In one account from a 15th century English household, a sick lady's chamber was entirely draped from ceiling to floor in wool and fur, transforming her bed into a healing shelter against the bitter air. These fabrics were more than luxury. They were memory and craft. The threads carried the warmth of human labor, of hands that wove, dyed, and stitched by firelight. And so, when winter winds howled through arrow slits and down chimneys, the castle's inhabitants sat beneath their embroidered walls and found a measure of peace wrapped in the quiet resilience of fabric and wool. Even now, centuries later, some of those ancient tapestries survive, dimmed in color, but still thick, still soft. They no longer guard against cold stone, but they remember the lives they once sheltered, the laughter and prayer that filled those rooms. As strange as it may sound to us now, one of the most reliable ways to keep a medieval castle warm was not fire, nor fabric, nor fur, but life itself. In an age when no machine or chimney could spread heat through vast halls of stone, warmth came from the breathing, beating bodies that shared them. Humans were not alone in this struggle against the cold. The animals that lived within the castle walls, dogs, cats, goats, sheep, horses, even birds, became part of its heating system. their warmth rising and mingling with that of the people who depended on them. Dogs, especially, were treasured not just for loyalty or protection, but for their heat. Large breeds like mastiffs, sheepdogs, and Newfoundlands were often allowed to sleep in their owners' chambers, sometimes even in the same bed. These were not pets in the modern sense. They were living blankets. Chroniclers describe noble ladies who refused to sleep without their warming dogs, and in some castles entire breeds were raised for this very purpose. They curled up at their master's feet, pressed their thick coats against bare legs, and turned the icy beds of winter into something close to bearable. It was even said, half in jest, half in belief, that a dog's breath could ward off evil spirits. But in truth, it was cold they feared most, and so they shared their nights with animals whose warmth was proof that life still flickered against the season's long darkness. Cats, too, played their part. Small, silent, and clever, they sought out every draught and every pocket of trapped warmth. To the people who watched them, cats were natural barometers of the castle's temperature. Wherever a cat settled, servants knew that spot was safe from the chill, and if a cat climbed beneath your blanket or curled on your chest, you didn't push it away. It was not superstition. It was survival. But beyond these beloved companions were the larger, humbler creatures whose heat rose from below. In many castles, livestock were housed directly beneath the main living quarters. Cows, goats, and sheep filling the air with the steady rhythm of breath and the low warmth of their bodies. Through wooden floors and narrow vents, that heat drifted upward, softening the cold in the rooms above. At Dover Castle, archaeologists uncovered evidence of exactly this: ventilation holes in the floors that allowed warm air from the stables to circulate through the living chambers. The system was crude, but it worked. Even without fire, the upper rooms could remain several degrees warmer simply from the animals below. Horses, perhaps the greatest producers of heat, were often kept in adjoining wings built directly against the outer walls. Their body warmth leaked through the stone, creating a strange and vital companionship between the stall and the hall. The builders of the Middle Ages understood this instinctively: warmth moves upward, and life gives heat. Even smaller creatures played an unintended role. Mice, rats, and birds nested deep within the cracks of walls and floors. Their presence was tolerated, especially in winter, because, as one medieval chronicler dryly noted, the rats warm the stones. It was not entirely a joke. Their countless bodies created a kind of living insulation, one more layer in the long battle to keep the frost outside. And then there were the geese. Warm, noisy, and indispensable. They were allowed in bedchambers not only because of their soft down and feathers, which made the finest blankets, but because their warmth and movement kept the room alive. Servants gathered their feathers carefully, stuffing pillows and quilts that trapped air better than anything else. Even today, goose down remains one of the best natural insulators known to humankind, a gift passed down from those same medieval halls. Within the rhythm of life in a castle, animals were not separate from people. They were partners in survival. The sound of hooves below, the snoring of dogs by the fire, the purring of cats on the windowsill, all were threads in the fabric of warmth that kept the great houses breathing through winter. It was not elegance nor engineering, but shared existence that defeated the cold. The hearth might fail, the fire might fade, but as long as the castle's creatures breathed together, the night could never truly freeze. There was another kind of fire in the medieval world, one that didn't glow in the hearth or flicker on the walls, but burned quietly inside the human chest. When the wind howled through the towers and frost grew along the window frames, people turned to warmth they could drink. In castles where even the thickest walls trembled under winter's breath, ale, wine, and herbal liqueurs were not luxuries. They were medicine. A mug of something steaming, heavy with spice and scent, could drive the cold from a man's bones more swiftly than any blanket. It was, in a way, the medieval version of central heating warmth that began in the hands and spread through the heart. The most beloved of these drinks was mulled wine. Hot wine simmered slowly with honey, cinnamon, cloves, and black pepper until its aroma filled the hall like a spell. It was poured into thick ceramic cups, its steam rising in ribbons that mingled with the faint smoke from the hearth. The first sip always felt like waking, the heat sliding down the throat, the spice stinging gently, the heart quickening with a kind of soft glowing strength. They drank it at dawn to start the blood moving, at noon to push back the damp chill of the stone halls, and again before sleep to quiet the body and ease the cold from tired limbs. Some castles even had a servant whose sole duty was to keep the drinks warm, the beverage keeper, as records call him, tending the small pot of spiced wine beside the fire and refilling cups through the long frozen evenings. Ale, too, was rarely served cold. Instead, it was heated, thick, and comforting, often sweetened with honey or flavoured with ginger and herbs. Hostesses in the great halls of England and Flanders kept kettles beside the fire, ready to boil beer for guests. To drink something cold in winter was to risk sickness. Warmth, in every form, was seen as life itself. The monasteries perfected this wisdom. There, the line between medicine and drink blurred entirely. Monks brewed herbal tinctures and spiced liqueurs, mixtures of strong wine infused with juniper, wormwood, or pepper, to drive out the dampness of the humours. Taken in tiny sips, these tonics not only healed sore throats and frozen joints, but filled the body with a deep inner heat that lingered for hours. Even children were not left out. They drank weak ale instead of water, low in alcohol but rich in calories, served warm in small wooden cups alongside porridge. Water drawn from cold wells was dangerous and chilling, but ale boiled and brewed was safe and warming. For the poor, the drink of winter was often a broth. Meat bones simmered for hours, thickened with barley and flavoured with onions and garlic. The warmth came not just from the heat, but from the fat, slow-burning fuel for the body in the cold months. In every meal, warmth was the measure of care. At the Lord's table, spices were prized above gold for the same reason. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, nutmeg, all of them made the blood stir, made the skin glow, made the body remember that it was alive. On the darkest nights, a few grains of spice could make a man feel like he sat beside the sun. The practice of warming from within was both physical and spiritual. They believed that fire, in all its forms, was divine, that to drink a warm cup of wine or broth was to share in a spark of that divine heat which kept the world alive through winter. And so, while the hearths burned low and frost crept across the battlements, you might have found a small group huddled near the coals, their hands cupped around steaming mugs, the candlelight flickering in their eyes. The fire outside was dim, but inside, in their throats and hearts, the fire still burned. If the fire failed, if the brazier dimmed, if even the dogs and blankets could no longer fight the creeping frost, there still remained one inexhaustible source of warmth, the body in motion. Medieval people understood, long before modern science put it into words, that heat comes from movement, and that blood itself is a living fire. To survive the long winters inside their stone labyrinths, they learned to turn every gesture, every task, every step into a small act of heating the flesh. The day in a castle began early and cold. Breath turned to smoke in the air, and hands trembled before the first spark of fire, yet no one stayed still for long. The servants rose before dawn, their bare feet slapping against the icy floors, carrying buckets of water, hauling firewood from the yard, polishing metal, feeding the animals. Each task kept the body alive through friction and repetition. Their muscles became their own kind of furnace. For those of higher birth, movement was no less vital, only different in form. Knights and squires spent their mornings training in the yard, their armour clanging like church bells, each swing of the sword sending warmth through the arms and chest. They fenced, wrestled, and rode even when the air stung with frost. Training was not only discipline, it was survival, a way to keep blood running hot beneath steel and wool. The ladies of the household had their own rhythm of motion. They spun yarn by the hearth, worked looms, stirred pots, folded linen, and washed clothing in cold water that numbed the fingers. But these quiet labours were not as still as they seemed. Every movement, the press of the foot on the spinning wheel, the stretch of the arm toward a shelf, kept life flowing through the body. The women's quarters, though smaller and rarely near the main hearth, were often the warmest rooms in a castle simply because no one there was ever idle. Even the monks and scribes who lived cloistered lives of stillness knew the secret. In the scriptoriums, where ink froze in winter, they followed strict rules to stand, bow, and stretch every hour. They rotated their wrists, opened and closed their fingers, tilted their heads toward their shoulders, whispering prayers not just for the soul but for the body that might otherwise grow stiff and cold. Movement was penitence and protection both. By evening, when work was done and the fires were coaxed back to life, the castle itself began to move. Music drifted through the hall, flutes, lutes, and soft drums, and people danced. The dances were simple, circular, communal. The carol, the estampi, the saltarello, hands clasped, feet stamped, skirts swirled, and laughter rose like heat itself. It was not entertainment alone. It was warmth disguised as joy. 1 hour of dancing could raise a person's body temperature enough to last through the long hours of a sleepless night. The chroniclers wrote of feasts where nobles danced until sweat shone on their temples and steam rose from their cloaks. They sang, they clapped, they moved until exhaustion felt like happiness, until the cold seemed like a thing that belonged to the walls and not to them. Even prayer, even worship, became movement. In cold chapels where the stones breathed frost, processions wound in slow, rhythmic steps. Kneeling, standing, bowing, all were acts of devotion and of warmth. The monks of Cluny and Citeaux walked in circles during winter psalms, each step an act of quiet resistance against the freezing air that clung to their robes. Children, ever restless, had their own kind of fire. They played in the courtyards, rolling, chasing, laughing until their cheeks burned red. The cold was their playmate, not their enemy. Medieval mothers, watching from the doors, rarely called them in early. They knew that running and shouting did more to keep them safe than sitting by a dying flame. Movement, then, was not just activity. It was an understanding, an instinct older than thought. To sit still was to surrender to the cold. To move, even gently, was to remain alive. The castles themselves seemed to learn this rhythm, their inhabitants in constant motion, walking, lifting, spinning, training, singing, every act a small pulse of warmth against the deep stone silence. It was the simplest truth of all. A living body in motion could outmatch the winter's breath, if only it kept moving. When night descended over the castle, and the corridors grew silent except for the whisper of the wind pressing against the walls, warmth was called once more to the centre. The hearth, the kitchen, the simmering pot. For all their grandeur, castles depended on food not merely as sustenance, but as medicine against the cold. Every meal, every sip, every smell of broth and bread was a small rebellion against the frost. In the early hours before dawnlight reached the towers, servants would rise to stir the embers left in the kitchen fire. There, in a vast cauldron blackened by years of smoke, something was always cooking, slow, thick, and fragrant. Warm food was never just about taste, it was about survival. The first spoonful of porridge, still steaming, could thaw the stiffness in fingers and wake the heart from its night's cold retreat. Breakfast in a medieval castle was simple but powerful. Bowls of hot grains softened with milk, butter, or honey, spiced pottages rich with oats or barley, or even meat broth for those who could afford it. The warmth spread outward from the belly, filling the body like a low fire filling a cold chamber. It was said that a man fed with hot food could endure the frost for hours, while one who ate cold bread alone would soon begin to tremble. By midday, when the fires in the braziers had waned and the great halls filled again with people, lunch became the heart of warmth. Thick soups, pottage, mortrue or broth spiced with garlic and onion, were ladled into wooden bowls. The richer households added meat, lentils, and wine. The poorer relied on cabbage, beans, and barley. Yet both meals did the same thing. They lit a slow-burning fire inside the body, one that could last through the afternoon chill. Fat was prized above all. Lard, butter, marrow, and oils were seen as fortifications against the cold. To eat well in winter was to build armor from within. The monks of northern abbeys noted in their journals that a fatty broth wards off the fever of frost, and castle cooks learned to blend their meals with heavy calories, roasted meats, thick pies, or stews so rich they gleamed in the firelight. Even the bread, always baked fresh and warmed near the fire before serving, became part of this thermal ritual. No one in winter ate cold bread if it could be helped. It was set upon grates near the hearth until the crust softened and the steam escaped, filling the air with the scent of yeast and grain. In the poorest quarters, that smell alone was comfort. Spices were the truest luxury of the medieval table, and not just for their flavor. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves were believed to possess warmth in their very nature, gifts from distant sunlit lands that carried heat from the tropics to the cold stones of Europe. Chroniclers wrote that a pinch of pepper warms the humours and drives out the chill from the bones. For the wealthy, to eat spiced food was not only to show wealth but to proclaim mastery over winter itself. The use of spices became ritualized: pepper and ginger in the morning to awaken the blood, cloves and garlic in the afternoon to strengthen digestion, nutmeg and cardamom in the evening to soothe and prepare for rest. The air of a well-fed hall was thick with this perfume of warmth, a mingling of smoke, wine, roasted meat, and spice that felt almost sacred in its comfort. Children and elders, the most vulnerable to cold, were given their own form of nourishment. Warm milk mixed with honey, eggs, and herbs was served before bed, the medieval version of a sleeping draught. It calmed the body and wrapped it, from the inside out, in quiet heat. Every act of cooking in a castle was also an act of faith. Servants stirring cauldrons knew that the fire they fed did more than prepare food. It gave life. The warmth of soup, the glow of the hearth, the laughter around a table heavy with bread and steam, all these were proofs that even the coldest walls could be tamed by human hands. And when the meal ended, the embers would still pulse beneath the ashes, promising another morning, another fire, another breath of warmth against the endless winter. At the very core of every medieval castle stood something greater than any throne or tower: the hearth. It was not merely a fireplace, but the living heart of the fortress, the silent sun around which all life revolved. In its glow, food was cooked, stories were told, and frozen hands reached toward the promise of survival. When it burned, the castle lived. When it went out, winter claimed everything. The great hearth was enormous, a structure of stone and iron that could swallow whole logs the size of a man. Some were 4 meters wide and 2 meters tall, deep enough that servants could stand inside to rearrange the wood. The flames climbed high, licking the soot-darkened beams, and the smoke wound slowly up through vast chimneys that twisted through the walls like arteries. Every spark, every crackle of burning oak was a heartbeat in the lungs of the castle. To build such a fire was a science. The stones at its base had to be cut from the hardest rock, baked in lime and sand so they would not crack under heat. The chimney above was carefully angled, steep enough to draw the smoke, shallow enough to trap the warmth. Many castles had secret channels carved within their walls, carrying the rising heat upward so that upper chambers and stairwells would grow faintly warmer. In their own way, these were the first primitive forms of central heating. The hearth was never allowed to die. From the first frost of October until the soft rains of April, it burned without rest. Firekeepers, servants of quiet discipline, took turns through the night, feeding it with oak, beech, or birch. Every few hours they stirred the embers, their faces orange in the glow, the air thick with ash and sleep. To let the hearth go out was an unspoken sin, a sign of neglect that could doom the household to cold and illness. It was said that the great fire could heat a hall of 300 square meters, enough for the entire household to gather and feel life return to their limbs. And yet the warmth was never uniform. Near the blaze, cheeks burned and eyes watered. A few steps away, the cold took hold again, creeping from the flagstones like mist. But people adapted. Benches and chairs were arranged in circles, furs draped over shoulders, and laughter filled the gap that the fire could not. The hearth's glow was also a kind of theatre. Shadows danced on the walls as minstrels played, and stories flowed like wine. Children listened to tales of saints and heroes, soldiers mended their boots, and nobles leaned close to discuss alliances and rumours. The fire connected them all. It was the common pulse in a divided world of rank and duty. Even in the architecture of faith, the hearth had its echo. Its smoke rose heavenward like a prayer, its light cut through darkness like grace. Many saw it as a symbol of divine endurance, the warmth of God's presence within cold mortal walls. The Latin word focus, meaning hearth, would later come to mean the center of attention, the point of life itself, and that meaning was born in these cold stone rooms, where everything revolved around the flame. At night, when the castle slept, the fire dimmed to a soft red breath, its embers glowing beneath a skin of ash. The hall would fall silent, but that faint, steady heat, pulsing quietly under the weight of stone, was proof that morning would come, that life continued even in the dead of winter. Thus the great hearth was more than warmth. It was memory, ritual, and hope. It gathered every other secret: the brazier, the hot stones, the layered clothes, the curtains, the dogs, the laughter, and held them in its light. It was the first and last defense against the dark, the living flame that turned a castle from a monument of power into a home. And when spring finally broke, when the fires were allowed to rest and the walls began to breathe again, people looked to the hearth, not with relief, but with gratitude. It had carried them through the long silence of winter, through nights when even stone seemed to shiver. A castle's greatness, they said, was not in its towers or its walls, but in the warmth of its fire. When the first snows settled on the towers and filled the moats with ice, the rhythm of castle life changed. The clatter of carts in the courtyard grew faint, and the air, once filled with the hum of labour, turned to quiet breath and soft footsteps. Winter made every motion slower, heavier, more deliberate, as if even time itself walked cautiously through the halls. The days began late. Light entered through narrow windows only after the servants had already risen, their breath misting as they hurried down stone staircases toward the kitchen fires. For the lord and his household, mornings were quiet rituals of survival. The heavy curtains were drawn aside to let in what little sun there was, and someone would carry in the first brazier of the day, its coals faintly glowing like embers from another world. Breakfast came warm and simple: a bowl of porridge, a heel of bread softened with ale or milk, perhaps a sliver of cheese or dried meat, for those of higher rank. The body was slow to wake in winter, and every gesture seemed to serve one purpose: to keep heat from escaping. Servants wrapped in wool moved through the corridors, tending to their duties with a practiced rhythm. Some brought hay for the animals beneath the floors, others carried bundles of firewood on their backs, their arms trembling with cold. Their breath mingled with the smoke that never quite left the air, and each call was as much about warmth as about necessity. The castle's great hall, once a space of feasts and voices, became a chamber of quiet endurance. The fire burned, but its reach was small. People gathered close, sharing the limited glow, sewing, mending, or reading aloud. The hum of conversation rose and fell like a slow tide, gentle and steady, a counterpoint to the moan of wind beyond the walls. Outside, the world froze into stillness. Drawbridges creaked, wells turned to solid ice, and the fields slept under snow. But within the fortress, life condensed, smaller, slower, more inward. The cold stripped everything down to what truly mattered: the fire, the food, the faces that shared the same air. The rhythm of winter was not one of hardship alone, but of reflection. With travel halted and labour subdued, people turned to quieter work, repairing tools, copying manuscripts, teaching children, praying. Time thickened like honey, and in that slow, muffled silence the castle became a world of its own, suspended between darkness and dawn. If there was one luxury that winter turned into a near miracle, it was the warmth of a bath. In an age when water was usually icy and scarce, and the air itself could bite the skin, the act of bathing in hot water became both medicine and ritual, a moment when the cold retreated and the body remembered what comfort felt like. Contrary to modern myth, medieval people did not fear washing. They longed for it, but in the stone chambers of a castle, heat was precious, and every drop of warm water had to be earned through fire and patience. Servants rose early, feeding the kitchen hearth with logs until the copper cauldrons began to tremble with steam. From there, bucket after bucket was carried through the corridors to fill great wooden tubs, barrels lined with linen or wax to keep the water from seeping away. For the nobles, bathing was an event. The tub would be placed near the hearth, its rim draped in cloths to keep the heat from escaping. Fragrant herbs, rosemary, lavender, sage, or thyme, were thrown into the water to perfume the steam and purify the skin. Sometimes, milk or honey was added, softening the water and turning it into something like liquid gold. A screen of fabric would be set around the bath to shield it from draughts. Candles burned low, and the air thickened with mist. The first step in was always a gasp, that meeting of flesh and warmth after days of chill, followed by a long silence as the muscles loosened and the blood began to move again. For a short time, the world outside, the frost, the stone, the endless winter, ceased to exist. The poorer folk of the castle, who could not spare so much firewood or privacy, made do with smaller rituals of warmth. They washed hands and faces in bowls near the kitchen, where steam rose from the cauldrons and the air smelled faintly of bread. Even that little heat was a blessing. Some would fill leather pouches with hot water and press them against their chests before bed, a humble cousin to the great baths of the nobility. In monasteries, communal baths were taken once or twice a month, often in wooden rooms filled with rising vapours. Monks sat in silence, the steam wrapping them like prayer, believing that cleansing the body also soothed the soul. They used scented oils to rub the skin afterward, sealing in the warmth for as long as possible before returning to the cold stone cloisters. For everyone, rich or poor, the warmth of bathing was fleeting, but that was precisely what made it sacred. The body, reawakened by the heat, would remember it for hours afterward. Skin glowed pink, breath came easier, sleep arrived faster. And though the castle's air would soon grow cold again, the warmth lingered, secret and invisible, beneath the skin. In the harsh stillness of winter, a bath was not vanity. It was survival made tender, a reminder that the human body, fragile as it was, could still make peace with the cold, if only for a little while. If warmth had a scent in the Middle Ages, it was not of perfume or flowers, but of smoke, thick, honest and everywhere. It clung to walls, to hair, to clothing. It drifted through corridors and lingered over every meal. The winter castle, for all its beauty and order, was a place of mingled odours, wood and wool, tallow and fur, iron and ash. To step inside was to enter a world that smelled of life compressed against the cold. The first and strongest fragrance was always fire. Oak smoke, sweet and heavy, rolled from the hearths, curling around the beams and fading into the draughts that slid through the stone. It mixed with the faint tang of hot iron from the braziers and the earthy scent of damp straw scattered over the floors to muffle the chill. Even the air in the great hall seemed flavoured by the fire, as though the stones themselves had learned to breathe smoke instead of air. In the kitchens, warmth and scent became one. The bubbling of broth, the fat of roasting meat, the hiss of dripping grease onto hot coals, all these released clouds of aroma that drifted upward into the castle's cold passages. On winter days, the smell of soup alone could make people gather closer, drawn to it like moths to a candle flame. But for every fragrance of comfort, there were others that told quieter truths about survival. Beneath the floors, the stables steamed with the breath of animals. Horses shifted in the straw, their coats damp with warmth. Cows exhaled clouds that mingled with the smell of hay and manure. This living scent, pungent, rich, oddly reassuring, seeped upward through cracks in the boards. It was not unpleasant to those who lived with it. It meant heat. It meant life. A castle without the smell of beasts was a castle too cold to endure. Furs, too, carried their own perfumes. The musky sweetness of sheepskin, the resin of oiled leather, the faint bitterness of smoke used to cure pelts. People wore their warmth, and warmth had its smell. The noblewoman's cloak might carry lavender and beeswax. The stable boy's tunic would smell of sweat and hay. Each scent told its place in the hierarchy of survival. The candles added their own note. Tallow, the rendered fat of animals, smoky and sour. In wealthy halls, beeswax candles glowed instead, releasing the faint sweetness of honey and sun. But for most, the air was laced with the acrid smell of animal fat burning slowly in the cold, a reminder that even light required sacrifice. And then there were the subtler smells, the faint spice of mulled wine from a distant room, the damp mineral scent of stone itself, the sharpness of iron tools warming by the fire. Sometimes, when the snow fell heavy outside and the wind stilled, all these scents seemed to mix into one great breath, the breath of the castle itself, alive, imperfect, human. Those who lived there did not find it unpleasant. The nose adjusted, the senses softened. The smell of smoke meant safety, of straw meant warmth, of fur meant protection. Even the odor of sweat and labor was comforting in its way. It meant that life, stubborn and ordinary, still went on behind the frozen walls. To modern minds, the medieval castle might seem a place of harshness, too full of scent, too full of closeness. But to those who knew it, it was home. Each smell was a promise of a meal, of a fire, of another day survived. And in that mingled perfume of smoke, animals and human effort, the cold lost its dominion for a little while. In the deepest weeks of winter, when the nights stretched endlessly and the frost turned the windows white, warmth became as much a matter of spirit as of fire. The people of the Middle Ages lived with a closeness to the elements that we can barely imagine. They felt the cold not only in their bones but in their thoughts. And when no brazier, no cloak, and no beast could drive it away, they turned to faith. The church bells still rang through the frozen air, their notes echoing faintly across the snow like distant voices calling through sleep. Inside the castle's small chapel, the cold was sharp as glass, the stone floor hard and unyielding. Yet candles burned there constantly, thin points of light trembling in the stillness. To the people gathered in that half-dark, those flames were not mere wax and wick. They were the souls of the living, burning despite the chill. Prayer, too, was a kind of warmth. The rhythm of whispered words, the slow exhalation of breath forming clouds in the cold air, the movement of hands joined together, all of it brought heat, faint but real. The act of faith gathered people close. It gave them something the fire could not. Meaning, in a world where frost could take a life overnight, believing that the soul burned brighter than the body, gave comfort that no blanket could offer. Monks understood this best. In their stone monasteries where the wind moaned through the cloisters, they rose before dawn to sing the morning hours. Their chants were slow and deep, echoing against the vaulted ceilings like waves of invisible fire. The repetition of sound filled the air, warming it not by heat but by presence. Many who heard it swore that the chill lessened as the psalms went on, as if the air itself bowed to the discipline of their voices. The faithful of the household followed the same instinct. Before meals they prayed together beside the hearth. Before sleep they murmured blessings for protection through the night's cold. Even the lighting of candles was an act of devotion, the small flame a symbol of divine warmth, a spark of heaven surviving in a mortal place. When the storms were too fierce and the castle gates closed tight, prayer became the thread that bound the days together. People spoke softly of saints who guarded travelers lost in the snow, of miracles where frozen rivers thawed overnight, of relics that gave off gentle heat when held in the hand. These tales, half legend and half memory, kept the heart burning when all else failed. Faith made the cold bearable, because it gave purpose to endurance. To suffer the chill patiently was a kind of offering, a test of spirit. The cold became something holy, a reminder that warmth, like grace, was never guaranteed, but always worth striving for. In the glow of the chapel candles, faces softened. You could see it there, the light reflected in tired eyes, the small smiles that rose as prayers ended, the sense that for a brief moment the stone walls were not prisons of frost but vessels of peace. And when they left, carrying that quiet warmth with them back into the corridors and chambers, the fire in the great hearth seemed to burn a little brighter, as though answering the echo of their faith. Because in the end, warmth was not only made of fire and fur and breath, it was also made of hope, and that, above all, was what kept the cold away. When the heart of winter came and the nights were longest, the people of the castle answered it not with silence but with celebration. The coldest weeks of the year were also the brightest, for they belonged to the feasts of midwinter, when light and fire were called back into the world through song, food, and ritual. In the depth of December, when frost clung to every beam and the moat lay frozen, the entire household turned its gaze toward one promise: Christmas. For weeks preparations filled the halls with noise and life. Servants carried evergreen branches through the corridors, the scent of pine and resin mingling with smoke and candle wax. Holly, ivy, and mistletoe were hung above doorways, reminders of the world still living beneath the snow. In the kitchens, warmth reached its peak. Ovens glowed with heat, and great cauldrons steamed from dawn till dusk. Flour was sifted for bread, fruit soaked in wine, and spices, once rarer than gold, were measured carefully into dishes that would make the whole castle smell of sweetness and fire. The scent of roasting meat and mulled ale drifted upward through the stairwells, turning even the coldest corners of the castle into echoes of comfort. The feast itself was an act of defiance against the season. The Lord's table would be set beneath banners and torches, the flickering flames making the gold cups shine like captured stars. Music filled the hall, flutes, viols, and small drums beating like a second heartbeat beside the fire. The poor and servants were invited to share in the abundance, for it was believed that generosity warmed the soul and pleased God. The dishes seemed endless: roasted boar glazed with honey, pies stuffed with venison, trenchers piled with bread, butter, and spiced wine. In the glow of the hearth, the faces of the people softened, red from heat, bright from laughter, their breath mixing with the smoke above the flames. For a few precious hours, hunger and cold were forgotten, replaced by a sense that winter could be conquered by community alone. Even when the last dish was cleared, the warmth lingered. Candles stayed lit through the night, their light believed to keep away darkness and spirits of the frost. Children ran through the corridors with ribbons, while older guests told stories by the dying fire, tales of winters past, of saints, of miracles, of snow that once melted overnight. Beyond Christmas lay Twelfth Night, the last and wildest of the celebrations. That evening the boundaries of rank were briefly erased. A lord of misrule was chosen, sometimes a servant, sometimes a jester, to preside over the feast. For a night, laughter ruled, and even the lord of the castle obeyed his mock commands. It was foolishness with purpose, a burst of warmth before the cold weeks resumed their rule. In those moments of light and song, people remembered that warmth was not only in fire or food, but in one another. Every shared cup of ale, every carol sung under a flickering torch, every hand clasped in laughter pushed the dark back a little further. Outside, the snow still fell, and the fields still slept. But inside the walls, beneath the banners and the glow of the great hearth, winter lost its power. The cold remained, but it no longer felt like an enemy. Because even in the age of frost and famine, the people of those castles knew a truth that outlived their stones, that joy once kindled burns hotter than any fire. When winter finally began to loosen its grip and the icicles along the towers melted one by one, the castle seemed to breathe again, not quickly, but with the long, heavy exhale of something that had survived. The snow on the battlements slipped quietly into the moat, the frozen air softened to mist, and the great fires, once tended through every hour of darkness, were left to burn slower, quieter, more peacefully. The room still held the smell of smoke and wool, but the urgency was gone. The braziers cooled a little earlier each night. The servants no longer woke before dawn to break the frost on the buckets, and the tapestries swayed gently in the milder wind that drifted through newly opened shutters. For months they had lived with winter as though it were an unwelcome guest, and now, as it packed its slow belongings and wandered off toward the mountains, they almost missed it. Not its cold, but the closeness it had forced upon them. In those months of frost, people had lived nearer to one another, nearer to the fire, nearer to silence. They had shared food, warmth, faith, and fatigue. They had learned the rhythm of patience, that kind of stillness which modern hearts so easily forget. In the absence of comfort, they had found a different kind of peace, one made of endurance and small joys. The first spark in a cold brazier, the moment the soup began to steam, the soft weight of a sleeping dog by the bed. Now with the thaw came movement. Carts creaking in the courtyard, birds calling from the towers, the sound of dripping water everywhere. Like a steady, patient applause, the castle began to stir back to life. Yet beneath the return of work and travel and noise, the quiet wisdom of winter lingered. They had learned once again that warmth is not a single thing. It is a chain of small mercies. A hand on your shoulder, a shared blanket, the faint glow of a coal refusing to die. When the fires were finally allowed to fade, and the nights grew soft instead of bitter, the castle's people did not curse the cold that had gone. They honoured it, because it had reminded them of what it meant to be alive together, against the elements, bound not by luxury but by need, by the shared defiance of those who keep the flame. And when darkness fell, even on a mild spring night, someone always stayed behind to watch the embers. There was no reason to keep the fire alive anymore. Yet they did, perhaps from habit or gratitude or reverence, because deep down they understood that every flame, no matter how small, is the same, a fragile light in a vast indifferent cold. And so the castle slept, the stones still warm from months of fire, the air soft with the promise of green fields waiting beyond its walls. The wind no longer howled but whispered. The frost was gone. The world turned slowly toward morning. And the fire, though no one spoke of it anymore, still glowed faintly in the dark, patient, steady, eternal,